So we're seeing very positive early numbers for Glenn Youngkin in those suburban strongholds, suburban Loudoun County, suburban DC, suburban Richmond, and then of course suburban Tidewater as well, which was always going to be a tougher path for Terry McAuliffe. Very, very interesting to see these early numbers come in, certainly boding well for Youngkin from a percentage standpoint, but as we mentioned, a higher quantity of votes, so certainly way too early to call a winner here either way. We'll get the results back on. I'm going to switch back to the House race for a second here. We've got one more call here, Jeff. In House District 12, Jason Ballard has defeated Chris Hurst. So that's another seat that flips to the Republicans. We've got 2 on the board so far. We'll pull up that map. And remember, the Democrats started the night with a 55-45 edge in the House of Delegates. 2 of them chipped away already. We'll be following that as the night goes on. I want to put some of the local races of interest up on the board here. We've got Roxanne Robinson, Deborah Gardner. We have not heard from Chesterfield so far, waiting to hear from Chesterfield on their ballots. So same in House District 66. That's Kirk Cox's old seat. Mike Cherry and Katie Sponsler. Zeros there. We'll keep an eye on that one. That is going to be a tough pickup for the Dems. And you look at this board right now, the way it's shaken out, the Democrats are not going to be picking up the tough pickup seats, it seems most likely. We'll go to Henrico, where we've heard from a lot of folks so far. Just waiting on the Richmond vote on this one. But Mark Early has a substantial lead over Dawn Adams, 57-43. Adams, the incumbent in the 68th district in Richmond. Mark Early has a commanding lead. Now, the Richmond vote expected to break towards Adams. We haven't heard from Richmond yet. Still waiting on their early vote, still waiting on their in-person vote. So way too early to call that one, but a big early lead for Mark Early Jr. coming in from Henrico. In District 72, this one's primarily Western Henrico. Rematch here, Schuyler Van Valkenburg is not holding his seat against Chris Holmes right now, but it's 52-48, so we're hanging on. Slight margins there. And in House District 73, same story out there in Western Henrico. Another rematch for you. Mary Margaret Castleberg, 4-point edge over Rodney Willett. I think this one's maybe a bit of a surprise, Jeff, to see, that Rodney Willett seat. A lot of late money came into that. $230,000 poured into that campaign at the end. I think Republicans sensed something potentially.
Yeah, and of course, that's a grudge match. Mary Margaret Castleberg took on Willett 2 years ago, and the result in that race pretty much mirrored the result of the Van Valkenburg race in the adjacent House district.
All right. Well, we heard from our political director, political editor, Andrew Kane, earlier today. He talked about the governor's race, what's important in those. And so right now we've got a video from him breaking down what we're going to see tonight as the night progresses. Stick with us all night. We'll be here as these results come in. It's going to be a fun night at richmond.com. Thanks to these guys for joining me. Right now, here's Andrew Kane on the governor's race and everything else you're going to want to watch as the night progresses.
Hi, I'm Andrew Kane, politics editor of the Richmond Times-Dispatch. I'm going to discuss 3 key factors in the contest for governor: margins, turnout, and enthusiasm. One reason why Virginia Republicans have not won a statewide election since 2009 is that Democrats win their strongholds by a much higher margins. This is why a higher turnout generally helps Democrats and a lower turnout helps Republicans. In 2017, when Democrat Ralph Northam beat Republican Ed Gillespie for governor, Gillespie carried 4 counties by 10,000 votes or more: Hanover, Bedford, Augusta, and Rockingham. Now consider that Northam carried Fairfax County alone by 138,000 votes. He won Arlington by 52,000 and the city of Richmond by 45,000. Northam also won Prince William, Loudoun, Henrico, Norfolk, and Alexandria by somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 votes each. In addition, Northam carried Newport News, Hampton, Portsmouth, and Albemarle by at least 10,000 votes each. That's a lot of numbers, but you see, this is why turnout matters. Traditionally, the higher the turnout, the better Democrats do. That's because it inflates their margins in the state's population centers. In a high turnout election, a sea of small Republican red counties all across the state don't match the vote totals from the Democratic strongholds. The good news for Republican Glenn Youngkin is that the Democrats' 2017 margins probably are a bit inflated. They came in a big Trump backlash the year after he was elected president. That year, the Virginia voter turnout was 47%, Virginia's highest in a contest for governor in 20 years. In presidential years, Virginia's voter turnout tops 70%. A year later, when Virginia elects a governor, turnout plummets into the 40s. But where in the 40s makes all the difference. In 2009, the last time Virginia elected a Republican governor, Bob McDonnell easily beat Democrat Cray Deeds in a 40% turnout. In 2013, the turnout was 43%, and Democrat Terry McAuliffe edged Republican Ken Cuccinelli by 2.5 points. In 2017, as we noted, turnout rose to 47%. The Democrats' margins ballooned, and Northern beat Gillespie by 9 points. Another key factor in this election is the enthusiasm gap. Multiple recent polls show that Republicans are hungrier to win. A Christopher Newport University survey said 80% of Republican likely voters are very enthusiastic, compared with just 65% of Democratic likely voters. So what we have here is a recipe for a toss-up. The big population centers give McAuliffe a built-in structural advantage, but Youngkin appears to have the momentum. Something's got to give. Can Youngkin hold down McAuliffe's Northern Virginia margins enough to prevail on election night? Time and the voter turnout will tell.
All right, thanks, Andrew, for that. Some more results coming in here, and right now, this does not reflect the current board. We've seen 46% of the election day vote. Glenn Youngkin has actually expanded his lead. Now, that's not unexpected. It's the rural counties that report first, but Glenn Youngkin right now has a 150,000 vote lead over Terry McAuliffe as these results come in. And this is what we told you, it's a little bit different than last time. These results are coming in significantly faster than they did last year. That's in part just everybody's a little bit more prepared after last year. Last year was the first year of early voting. We're going to put this on the board to show you just how different it is. In the 2017 election, there were only 195,000 early votes cast. It just wasn't something that happened. Then last year, 2.8 million overwhelmed the system. We didn't get those final numbers night of. Now this year, 1.1 million, still seeing just tremendous turnout across the board. Huge turnout today. And what's interesting, though, is where the enthusiasm is. So I'm going to put this up on the board here. This is the early voting per 1,000 registered voters. You look at this, the Richmond area fired up, the Northern Virginia area fired up. But at the same time, we are not seeing this break for McAuliffe the way you would expect this to break for McAuliffe at the numbers you would expect it to. And as we drill down the numbers, you can see why. Early voting in the Richmond area primarily centered in Chesterfield, not the city of Richmond. The city of Richmond had the least early voting of any of the big four localities. Henrico, Hanover, Chesterfield, all early voting at a higher clip. And we've seen in the turnout today, suburban Richmond really coming out to make their voices heard in this governor's election, this gubernatorial year. That bodes well for Glenn Youngkin. So we say coming into this, it's a turnout election, and McAuliffe wants a lot of voters. Well, a lot of voters showed up, but they came from the areas that are supporting Glenn Youngkin. So very interesting to see. We're going to put this on the board now. This is why we keep talking about Northern Virginia, and Richmond, and Hampton Roads. And this is the population density map right here. You can just see this is where all the people are. And so McAuliffe can win these areas by small numbers, but still have a huge advantage because of the number of people in those areas. So that's something we're going to be keeping an eye on as it goes. Presidential year against the governor's year. 2017, we saw 48% turnout for the gubernatorial race. That was a high water mark at the time, and it looks like we're going to smash that number tonight. So even though Trump's gone, still a lot of interest in this race, particularly a lot of interest in the suburbs as the Republicans look for their first statewide win since 2009. That was Bob McDonnell defeating Cray Deeds. And I think the turnout is the big story early, Kelly. It's a lot of people coming out to vote, but not necessarily the turnout you would expect for this thing to go to the Democrats.
And I'm liking that you called out the different areas, because in the city of Richmond, as we were just laughing, it's been a rainy day. And I walked straight up to the polling area with no problems, and I didn't see any long lines. Can we talk a little bit about that and whether or not the younger generation, did they get out and vote today?
Well, clearly we see who is most motivated here, who's most animated here. Clearly Republican voters. I'm wondering, and Jeff I'd like to bounce this off you, are the voters reflecting a level of Democratic Party complacency here? Mm-hmm. Because it seems like the Democrats suddenly found themselves in a situation just in leading up to this election, in the last weeks of this election, that they totally did not anticipate.
Well, I think part of it has to do with Trump's absence. Remember, for 4 years, starting in 2016, the Trump presence was an animating one. I mean, he was a one-man get-out-the-vote operation for the Democrats. The gains were impressive. I think the argument that the Republicans have made is that it sort of overcorrected, and that we were due for some type of rebalancing. I think we could be seeing that today with the Virginia result. We're also seeing areas that had performed well for Democrats not performing as well. So Montgomery County, which has been as sort of an island of blue and a sea of red, looks to be going comfortably Republican. And that's one of the reasons it was doing so well for the Democrats, is because of that particular school called Virginia Tech, and then Radford as well. But those academic communities were just sort of hubs of liberal Democratic votes. We're not seeing that level of enthusiasm this year for sure.
How much of this do you think is a backlash to what happened in 2020 and our moment of racial reckoning, the removal of the monuments, and just the progressive tilt that we saw during the pandemic? And how much of this is what's happening in Washington with Joe Biden?
There is clearly a sense among voters of Democratic overreach, and there has been a good deal of that woven into the Republican pitch. Just on this matter of education, of classes, of study. Youngkin keeps talking about how we shouldn't be looking at everything through the lens of race. Well, I mean, it's pretty clear what that's all about and what that is a reaction to.
So 1 year of race consciousness, that's enough. I mean, so we get this fictional issue of critical race theory that's kind of a blatant dog whistle, not kind of, that becomes a dominant theme in the campaign, something that does not exist in the state of Virginia, on a K-12 level.
I wonder, the effort to link Youngkin and Trump by McAuliffe. It's a credible issue. I wonder if part of the problem through this campaign has been the messenger. McAuliffe has a way of sort of, blotting out whatever it is he's trying to say by being, hyper animated and high decibel. Maybe someone could have made that more convincingly than, say, Terry McAuliffe did.
Cool.
I want to come back in with some quick results here now. We've got a fresh batch of results coming in, and boy, these ones favor Glenn Youngkin pretty decisively. Stafford County up by Quantico, suburban, exurban D.C. Joe Biden carries Stafford County by 3 points. Folks, we've heard from every precinct in Stafford County. The results are in. Glenn Youngkin wins by 18 points in Stafford County, 23,900 votes to 15,829 for McAuliffe. Big Republican gains coming in across the exurban areas. Loudoun County, we cited earlier, as being an area that has tilted away from Biden towards Glenn Youngkin. This latest batch of results here, very pro-Youngkin coming in. Before I go back to you guys, we have heard from portions of Chesterfield, so I'll put these Chesterfield races on the board because I know these are of local importance to folks. Roxanne Robinson up 55-45. Roxanne Robinson, the incumbent since 2010. Democrats saw this as a seat they could potentially swing. Robinson only won by 189 votes the last time around, but Chesterfield mirroring what we were just talking about up in Northern Virginia, the suburban, exurban areas breaking towards the Republicans in this off-year election. The price you pay for winning the presidential election, often those numbers go down the next year. And then House District 66. This is Kurt Cox's seat. This was always going to be a lift for the Democrats, and that's exactly what we're seeing. Mike Cherry, 57% of the vote. Katie Sponsler, 43% of the vote. 67% of the precincts in from Chesterfield. So we're starting to see some action, starting to see some movement there. We'll tee back up the Henrico results where Mark Early is leading Dawn Adams. Still early in that one, way too early to call that. Chris Holmes over Skylar Van Valkenburg by 4 points. We're getting near the end there, but again, a really tight race. No call for you just yet. And then you're surprised in House District 73, Mary Margaret Castleberg, as these numbers keep coming in, she's now got only a 2-point lead on Rodney Willett. So some really tight races in the House, some really tight races in the Henrico suburbs we're seeing tonight. Very interesting all the way around Virginia. We saw a lot of late campaigning there. and we'll update you. Still nothing from Richmond, so still no casino vote to report back. And obviously on the Mark Gurley, Dawn Adams race, we're waiting to get more from Richmond there. But we're seeing a lot of national pundits now saying this thing is starting to swing towards Glenn Youngkin. The more of the vote we see, these McAuliffe strongholds just are not coming through for them so far. And I would be curious, Jeff, your perspective here. How much of this is, you remember McAuliffe really bucked the trend last time he won in 2013. The Democrats had just won the presidency, but McAuliffe takes the governor's race against that, which was breaking the trend. We're seeing a lot more on-trend lines here. How real is that the party that wins the presidency seems to pay the price the next year in Virginia?
Every presidential election since 1976, the party that wins the White House loses the Virginia governorship the following year. That curse, that Virginia curse, if you will, has been disrupted only once by Terry McAuliffe in 2013 in a three-way race against a Republican who was as, shall we say, unpopular with his party as McAuliffe was with his. It was a three-way race. Robert Sarvis, a libertarian, pulled 7% of the vote. That had largely to do with distaste for Cuccinelli and McAuliffe. And so you had a Democrat squeak by, in part helped by the shutdown of the federal government, 2 weeks or so. But remember, that was followed by the Bakke rollout of Obamacare, and that gave Cuccinelli a big lift. And in fact, there are Democrats who say that if that had continued for another couple of weeks, it might have been Governor Cuccinelli rather than Governor McAuliffe.
Jeff Shapiro, our analyst, as Michael Paul Williams as well. And I want to dig in a little bit more with you on the nomination of Terry McAuliffe, period. There were younger candidates. There were more diverse candidates. The Democrats go with Terry McAuliffe. Are they paying the price for that tonight?
I think they are. Not as long, but I had reservations about it personally at the time. It just seemed wrong for the moment. And I don't know why they couldn't have developed a bench that didn't have them going back. We've had Mills Godwin. Is that the only governor that managed to pull that off? I mean, that's not easy.
1973 there. It's a deep pull.
Yeah, and I would have liked to have seen a woman. It seemed like time for a woman to be the standard bearer in Virginia politics. And the spectacle of McAuliffe effectively taking out two African-American women, not a great look.
And Princess Banning being added to this ticket, as you just talked about, Jeff, how is that also, that vote for that black woman instead of Youngkin or McAuliffe affect this race as well?
Any votes that Blanding picks up would have logically gone to McAuliffe, or be presumed to have gone to McAuliffe. It was interesting, in 1973, when Godwin won that second term, much as McAuliffe is, Godwin was facing headwinds, national headwinds. There was Nixon and Watergate. There were gasoline shortages. There was an uneven economy. And yet Godwin won largely because Virginia reverted to form. 1973, it was a state of barely 5 million people, but it was a center-right state. 2021, McAuliffe is facing headwinds, pushback to Bidenism, disappointment with Democratic dickering over these infrastructure bills, some economic uncertainty. If Virginia were reverting to form, might he be in a stronger position than he is at this point in the evening?
Well, but Linwood Holton and his running mate, J. Sergeant Reynolds, might be looked at as the most woke ticket of that era. And
remember, one was a Republican, the other was a Democrat.
Yeah, but just what they embodied in the way of rejection of Virginia's racist past. Was there a backlash to that, maybe? Just maybe that.
Oh, there certainly was. I mean, Linwood Holton, who just died last week, in his inaugural address, talked about racial healing and an aristocracy of merit, and as George Wallace was standing in schoolhouse doors, Linwood Holton was walking his children into freshly desegregated public schools in Richmond. You know, the contrasts could not be more dramatic. But that triggered a good deal of resentment and hostility among, shall we say, whites with a more traditional view of race.
Are we seeing that today play out?
Wouldn't you think, but perhaps with a bit more subtlety than we saw in Virginia of the late 60s?
I don't know how subtle critical race theory is, but
Well, in contrast with, street protests by angry white parents who weren't going to see their children, bused just in schools.
But what I'm seeing, I mean, is education again. Back then, we had Save Our Schools, Save Our Neighborhood School. I remember the caravan to Washington, the red schoolhouse bumper stickers, the flight through the suburbs. And now we have school board meetings that are extremely contentious. And it's like, back then, we don't want our kids in the same classroom with black students. And now it's like, we don't want black history in these classrooms. We don't want to hear these stories that will upset our children and create a narrative that we don't like.
Well, one of the things that I find so interesting about this is Virginia is a state that is 42% non-white. When Godwin was running the first time in 65 and then running a second time in 73, this was a state in which most Virginians were either black or white. We had a smattering of Native Americans. But now we have a population that is at 42% non-white, roughly 20% black, 10% Asian, the balance Hispanic. And concentrated in places like Northern Virginia, but here in the Richmond area as well. I mean, Virginia is very much a multi-hued state.
Wouldn't you have thought that demographics would have made this sort of debacle for Democrats, made them bulletproof to that? It's not easily relatable to what Virginia was in the past demographically.
Well, part of the challenge here is that just because there are larger numbers of Asians and Latinos in the population doesn't mean that they have a comparable throw within the electorate, that their registration rates track their presence in the population. This is part of the problem, for example, in Texas, where there have been huge increases in the number of Spanish-speaking residents, but we're not seeing the growth in registration that it parallels the growth in population.
The presence of y'all on the ticket was not animating to the Latino population, you don't think?
I suspect it was, but apparently not sufficient. She's from Prince William County, which is the second largest jurisdiction in the state, behind Fairfax. And like Fairfax, majority minority. If you are a white person in either of those counties, you are outnumbered. But also in these counties, as they become more diverse, we're also seeing evidence that wealth is more widely shared. So that in a place like Loudoun County, where it's 42% non-white, as it is in the state, prosperity is evident among people of color as well. Many of them, the new Virginians, Asians, and Latinos.
This is a fascinating conversation. This is great television, why we've got you guys here. Kelly, you just wind these guys up, let them go. This is what we came here for.
You notice I just shut up because I was learning too.
The art of television here is learning when not to talk as well. But we got to bring you back to the update board because we've got a few updates to share with you. One of them is this thing's closing in the Lieutenant Governor and the Attorney General spots. Jason Miara is 55% to Mark Herring's 45, Winsome Sears 55 to Hala Ayala's 45. Those numbers now beginning to track what we're seeing on the big board with the governor's race. So you saw that separation earlier tonight. We talked about the potential for a split ticket. That seems to be largely disappearing at this hour as more votes come in. We're seeing more straight ticket voting. It seems more and more unlikely that we'll have that, and more likely that it will be a straight ticket winner either for the Republicans or the Democrats when this night ends. Too early to call right now. Jeff, we passed this along for our friend Jonathan Martin, the New York Times. Says everybody's out here talking about Loudoun County. What you really need to look at is Virginia Beach. And let's take a look at Virginia Beach here in this governor's contest. Virginia Beach, last go-round, 51% of the vote for Ralph Northam. This go-round, 58% of the vote for Glenn Youngkin, as we've heard from 60% of the vote in Virginia Beach. So big margins for Glenn Youngkin on the fringes of those urban populations. You're still talking about Terry McAuliffe winning decisively in Fairfax City, in Richmond City, in Norfolk. These are the places that McAuliffe carries, but in the suburbs where Joe Biden was so successful against Donald Trump, these suburban spots just are not holding for the Democrats tonight. They are breaking to the Republican side. And as a result, a lot of optimism at that Glenn Youngkin campaign, a lot of momentum over there behind that. We're going to check in with both campaigns live later. We've got reporters around the state. We'll be excited to hear from them. We've got a lot going on tonight, a lot to see and do. And of course, we want to hear more from these guys. We've got Kelly went out earlier this week and was talking with some folks about issues that matter to them. And one of those issues is marijuana reform, which, of course, was very big in this year's General Assembly. Kelly, what do you got for us?
I got to talk to Najist and Reverend Barber, who are both on the cannabis boards. And I actually talked to them more about how the election, moves cannabis forward or holds cannabis back. And so here's what they had to say about that. The gist. Thank you so much for joining us tonight to talk about cannabis. So give a full introduction of who you are and what you are doing in this industry.
Sure. My name is Nigista Bebi, and I am Vice President of Public Policy at Columbia Care, one of the medical processors here in Virginia. And I'm also one of the appointees to the Health Advisory Board that oversees the regulatory processes at the Cannabis Control Authority here in Virginia.
When we talk about cannabis in Virginia, first of all, me and you would never think that we'd be talking about it this deeply on this platform from Virginia, right?
Truly, if you'd told anybody 10 years ago this is where we would be, I think we would have thought that's cute.
Yeah.
But this is pretty exciting. It's a really exciting point.
Yeah. Talk about where we are right now with cannabis, especially from a law standpoint, and then what should we be expecting over these next 12 months?
So right now, we're kind of in an intermediate stage in legalization. It's legal to possess in public on your person. It's not legal to publicly consume anywhere. Feel really important to specify that. And it's legal to grow up to 4 plants in your home. But there's no legal way to acquire cannabis. There's no legal way to acquire seeds and cuttings. And so we are seeing a reduction in arrests, which is really important for stopping the harm from the war on drugs. But we haven't yet been able to launch the opportunity that comes with the cannabis economy as well. And we also still have to finish some of the job on justice. We still have to do resentencing reform. We have to figure out ways to speed up our expungement processes, as well as figure out ways to build out this social equity program to ensure that folks who are most harmed by cannabis prohibition get a fair shot at entering the cannabis industry.
Yeah. There's so many laws and legal terms for something that, for a majority of people, it's in the streets, How do you make it make sense to everyone when they are like, no, I can just smoke in public. No, they're letting all my friends out of jail. Like all of these rumors that are flying around, how does your organization and people like you kind of dispel some of that?
So at Columbia Care, we work with a bunch of different groups, from Virginia NORML to where I actually sit on the board at Virginia NORML as well, to groups like the Virginia Minority Cannabis Coalition, No Left Turns, which is a well-known Richmond organization that does a lot of justice work as well. We work with partners in the community to ensure consumer safety and justice reform. And we've actually just this month in November are launching a boot camp for aspiring entrepreneurs who have past cannabis convictions or other impacts from the war on drugs to help them get their business plans in order. Because while we don't know how licenses and businesses are going to be started, we do know that that's coming, and we want to help people and ensure that folks get their plans together and are ready to seize the opportunities ahead.
Does this election have anything to do with the forward progression, or will it stop the legalization of cannabis in Virginia?
So I don't think you can stop the legalization because it is legal to possess now. And the question is not if, but how. And so regardless of how things turn out tonight, cannabis is going to be an issue. It has already been an issue, and we have to finish the job of legalization, and we have to get this market up and running, as well as finish the job of these justice reforms so that we can actually start undoing harms and start looking at ways to be reinvesting back into communities that were hurt by the war on drugs.
If you could tell our viewers anything that they need to know or start paying attention to when it comes to the cannabis industry, what would you say to them at this moment they need to start focusing on?
Number one, the job isn't over just because you voted today. The cannabis policy directly impacts whatever opportunities you want to see. If you want to be an entrepreneur in the industry, if you were impacted by the war on drugs, now is the time to start paying even more attention, because the moment the legislative session starts in January, all of these issues are going to be up for conversation regardless of who wins tonight. And it's important, if you care about cannabis policy, whichever part of it you're passionate about, to stay involved in between election cycles, to follow. And I always recommend Virginia NORML. They have a ton of information about where your local representatives stand on these issues, and they will have regular calls to action to help you mobilize and stay up to date and make sure that if you care about this issue and if you want to see cannabis legalized a certain way, that you have the power and the resources to tell your representatives what you want to see done.
And we're back. Thank you, Kelly, for that segment. You're watching live election night coverage from Richmond.com, the Richmond Times-Dispatch. We are statewide, following all the important races here tonight, and we want to re-tee this up here. The storyline tonight, Virginia swinging to the right. Too early to call. There's no call in this governor's race yet, but early signs very promising for Glenn Youngkin as he carries the suburban metro areas in the state. You talk about the big three in Loudoun County, big night for Glenn Youngkin. In Chesterfield and Henrico counties, big night for Glenn Youngkin. And then we just mentioned in Virginia Beach, a big night for Glenn Youngkin. Will it be enough to overcome the sheer numbers of the metro areas? We haven't heard from Richmond yet. We haven't heard from Fairfax yet. So still a lot of numbers left to come. Down ticket, you've got the lieutenant governor race, Winsome Sears and Ayala. Those numbers so far tracking with the gubernatorial race. Same with the attorney general's race, Jason Miyares and Mark Herring. We've got the guy who knows more about this than anybody else in the state. Kelly, you're with Patrick Wilson, and let's break this thing down.
All right, Patrick, thank you for joining the table. I don't know if you've already heard this conversation, but it is very enlightening and deep as we are going back in history with some of this conversation as well. Talk about the surprises of tonight.
Well, tonight was one of those nights where I don't know what might have been a surprise. You know, my thought was if the Democrats win, that's not going to surprise me. If the Republicans win, that wouldn't surprise me. The polling was very close, and the Republican statewide ticket has had a lot of momentum the last few weeks, which has been, commented upon by many people nationally and locally. One thing we're seeing in the returns right now, in addition to the strong showing by the statewide Republican candidates, is a lot of Democrats in the House of Delegates are in trouble. It almost looks like if the numbers came in and keep moving as they are, it would be a reverse of 2017, where there was a Democratic wave election as a backlash to Donald Trump, where Ralph Northam won the governor's mansion over Ed Gillespie, and the Democrats flipped enough seats to almost take control of the House of Delegates.
Then 15 came within a single seat of
It
taking
ended
the
up
House of
with a
Delegates.
bowl, a tie vote being drawn by random selection. And tonight, if the numbers hold up, we're seeing a lot of Democratic delegates possibly losing to Republicans, and that pendulum's shifting back. Now, on the races for Attorney General and Lieutenant Governor, the Attorney General's race would be, I guess that might be kind of surprising if we see a two-term incumbent statewide office holder lose. Mark Herring, the Democratic incumbent, is facing Jason Miyares, a delegate from Virginia Beach who's been in the General Assembly since 2015. And Miyares has run a very aggressive campaign on law and order, on criminal justice, attacking Mark Herring as being weak on crime and supportive of criminals over crime victims. The race for lieutenant governor is also interesting and taking on a lot of importance now if the Republicans win, because the lieutenant governor breaks tie votes in the state Senate. And that's they preside over the chamber, but that's one of the most important parts of that job. That office is held right now by a Democrat, Justin Fairfax. And even though the Democrats are in control of the state Senate 21-19, there were over 50 votes in the term the last 4 years that Justin Fairfax broke the tie on. One of them was a key abortion bill that the Democrats had pushed. And so if the Republican candidate for that office is Winsome Sears, a former state lawmaker from the Norfolk area who now lives in Winchester. If Winsome Sears is elected lieutenant governor, she'll preside over the state Senate and she'll have the tie-breaking vote. And so even though the Democrats have control of the chamber, there is one Democrat at least who is willing to join Republicans on certain votes. That's Senator Joe Morrissey from the Richmond area, who is a Catholic and describes himself as pro-life and has said in the Times-Dispatch that he's willing to join Republicans on the abortion issue. If that was to happen, the Republicans might be able to pass abortion legislation through both chambers, assuming they take control of the House of Delegates and they're able to convince a Democrat to join them in the Senate. They could pass a bill and get it presumably to Governor-elect Youngkin's desk, assuming that the numbers don't change before the end of the night and the Republicans win all these seats. So that's kind of a look at what the importance is for the lieutenant governor spot.
One of the things about the candidates for lieutenant governor is their level of inexperience. Winsome Sears was perhaps a two-term delegate.
I think just one term.
Ran for the House of Representatives, was defeated. Hala Ayala was part of that class of 17. At one point, there were, 4 candidates for statewide office, all Democrats from Prince William County. They really sort of were quite full of themselves, having pulled off these big victories. But it raises an interesting question, given the level of inexperience. Who is likely to really be in a position to kind of guide the Senate? And one would think it would be Tommy Norman, the Republican leader, who is a master of process, understands the rules probably much better than many members of the Senate. I would think that he'd really have the upper hand in the Senate going forward, regardless of who is the
You're
lieutenant
talking
governor.
about procedural issues. Yeah, the lieutenant governor the public doesn't, it's hard to explain maybe how this works. There was, I think, a TV ad talking about how this person's next in line to be governor, and that's why it's important. And the importance is different than that. That tie-breaking vote is very important, but a lot of the duties of lieutenant governor are ceremonial in welcoming people to the state Senate and then in presiding over the chamber. There is a lot of very complicated legal nuance when you're presiding over the chamber. The things that I would never be able to figure out myself, maybe after a couple of years of training, that's probably one of the more challenging parts of the job, is to learn all the parliamentary procedure that you need to basically run the state Senate. But the tie-breaking vote, I think, if we have a new Republican governor and we have a Republican House of Delegates, that Senate that's Democratic is what could make or break whatever the new Republican governor wants. If he wants to get something through the Senate, he may have to compromise or make some deals, but they do have that tie-breaking vote as well. If they just convince one Democrat to join in on something, he could push legislation through.
Patrick, we've only got another minute with you here, but you've written extensively about Dominion and their influence on politics. I'd love to hear from you what influence they had on this election and how their influence may be shifting over these years.
Yeah, I think Dominion Energy's involvement in this election sort of fell right in line with Glenn Youngkin's positions on the things that hit people in their wallet, the things that hit average Joe taxpayer. And Youngkin talked about gasoline and groceries. And then electric bills are an important part, that goes hand in hand with that. And a lot of lawmakers have focused in the last few years on high electric bills and the things that the legislature has done that keep them high and allow Dominion Energy to earn profits that are higher than the fair amount under the law. So you have the state's largest electrical utility gets involved in donating to a political action committee that tried to undercut Glenn Youngkin and damage him, and Youngkin was having none of it. And he really stuck it to Dominion in advertising and statements and things that he said in a way that the utility has, I don't think, they haven't faced that type of, where they faced aggressive responses from politicians, but this is a candidate for governor who appears to be winning. So this is a whole new level for the utility to be dealing with.
If I might add, this is what we saw from a Democrat in the 70s by the name of Henry Howell, who went after then the Virginia Electric and Power Company, the antecedent to Dominion Energy. His pledge was to keep the big boys honest. The other thing that the Youngkin campaign adopted, this pledge to do away with the sales tax on groceries. This was a very popular issue with Henry Howell in his statewide campaigns. 1973, when he ran the second time, frankly, I'm sort of surprised the Youngkin people didn't pick up this slogan and use it themselves. Mills Godwin, who was then running for that second term for governor, was attacked as too taxing. What was fascinating about that is that not even 8 years earlier, it was Godwin in his first term who shepherded through the sales tax, which applied to, among other things, groceries, and was considered this huge investment in public services, whether it was community colleges, hospitals, you name it. It was a deemed great progressive stroke, but in difficult times, a burden.
You may have to get to this in the next segment, but it makes me wonder, did the Republican ticket steal the Democratic issue of being for the little guy when they talked about the price of gasoline and trying to do something about it? You know, the Democratic Party has always been the party of the common person, the worker, and in this election, did the Republicans sort of yank some of that away from them?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we've seen, and this is evident in Virginia as well, as the parties become more distinct in their personalities and their appeal, that the standing of the Republican Party among college-educated voters seems to have diminished, that it is a party that is much more closely associated with the working classes. A role, of course, that one associated with the Democratic Party for so long.
Well, Patrick, we thank you for coming by. Read his work in the Richmond Times-Dispatch tomorrow.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Kelly and Jeff.
Thank you, Patrick.
All right. Well, earlier this week, we talked to Senator Tim Kaine, and he gave his thoughts on the election and the turnout. Let's hear from him right now. We'll be back with Becky Bromley-Trujillo of CNU's Watson Center for Civic Leadership. We'll get her thoughts on the polling and how this race is shaken out right after this. These comments from Tim Kaine earlier this week.
Every election these days does get affected by people's perceptions of what's going on at the national level. And so that will affect the Virginia governor's race. It'll affect the Virginia House races. We're already in early voting and seeing turnout that I'm happy with, at least early. But I'm very hopeful, and frankly, more than hopeful, I'm confident we're going to get a deal on an infrastructure bill and a reconciliation bill that's going to be very, very good for Virginia pretty quick here. And in the same way that Democrats only passed a bill in March that restarted loans to small businesses and that enabled people to get financial support during the toughest time of the pandemic and provided child care support so child care centers could stay open. And we did that purely with Democratic votes in March. You're likely to see, I think, a big win delivered by Democrats and by President Biden here, and that will play into the thinking of Virginia voters, I'm sure, in the November election.
And we are back with the Richmond Times-Dispatch's live election night coverage from our Richmond studios. A very eventful evening. We would like to bring in to break it all down with us Becky Bromley-Trujillo from CNU, from the Watson Center for Civic Leadership. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
All right. Well, let's get straight to it. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of Republican enthusiasm so far early. What did you guys see in your polling? What led you to think this could be where we were headed?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we saw this in our polling just a few days ago. So Republicans are significantly more enthusiastic than Democrats. And our polling, 80% of Republicans indicated they're very enthusiastic about voting in these elections compared to 65% of Democrats. And this is certainly evidenced in the turnout that we're seeing among Republicans. Democrats are still coming out as well, but it certainly seems like Republicans are having the advantage thus far.
Yeah, big turnout across the board. What are the issues that are bringing people to the polls today?
Yeah, so really the issue that kind of snuck up and then dominated was education, and with education, it was more of the culture war aspect of education. So things like critical race theory, transgender policy, mask mandates, that kind of stuff. So culture war all the way.
A big night for the culture war, so to speak. Tell us about how this race evolved over time. You guys have obviously been pulling on this for a while. This was considered a McAuliffe win in some quarters as recently as a few months ago.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So when we first started polling these races, a couple months ago, it really was looking like Democrats were going to clean up. McAuliffe was up by 9 points in our polling in August. And, it looks like, okay, Virginia has been trending blue, and so that's continuing to be the case. But the race dramatically started to shift and tighten, and a month later, our polling showed McAuliffe up by 4. And then just a few days ago, our polling showed McAuliffe up by 1. And I'd say what's going on there, one of the biggest things is definitely the national factors. Biden's presidency, he's underwater in his popularity in the state. And, McAuliffe had leaned into Biden and his connection to Biden early on. So it was very hard to separate himself from that national situation going on.
She's Becky Bromley-Trujillo from CNU. And is this different at all if they pass infrastructure, if there's less of a gridlock in Washington, or was this always going to be this way?
I hear a lot of people thinking that the infrastructure challenges and getting that through Congress are to blame. I'd say a lot of this was there, whether that happened or not, but certainly did not help. I will definitely say that. But Biden is struggling not just because he's struggling to pass his agenda. It's also the pandemic is just kind of continuing on. It's harming economic growth, and those things don't look good. And certainly, the gridlock does not help. But there are national factors, and this state is also historically known to shift away from the party in power in these off-year elections. And so this is exactly what we might expect to see given those historical circumstances.
One guy who's broken that trend, Terry McAuliffe, it appears lightning does not strike twice, at least in these early results. So we'll leave you on this, the question everybody always asks, what's next, 2022? I know you guys will be turning your attention to that very soon. What does this mean for what's going to happen next November?
So certainly it's an indication that Democrats are struggling now, and there's every indication Democrats will struggle in the midterm elections no matter what happens in this state. But it could certainly impact how candidates operate. If Youngkin wins and it's looking like he's doing well so far, then that's really a playbook for the Republican Party to kind of lean into the same kind of issues that he has, and also to, toe the line of being a bit moderate or avoiding some issues and sort of making the Trump supporters happy at some level, but not diving all the way in there. And that's worked for Youngkin, so that might be something that other Republicans take advantage of in their election.
Becky Bromley-Trujillo from CNU. Thank you for taking a few minutes joining us tonight. And we look forward to your election coverage here and into the next year.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, this is the Richmond Times-Dispatch's live coverage of election 2021. Michael Phillips here in our downtown Richmond studios, along with our panel of experts, Michael Paul Williams, Kelly Lemon, and Jeff Shapiro. And she brings up a lot of very interesting points there, one of them being kind of the national factor, the national implication going forward. Democrats really running against Donald Trump in this election. We see that not working. What's the winning formula for them going forward? What do they need to hitch their wagon to reverse their fortunes here in 2022 and going forward?
I would say legislation that actually helps people. I mean, it just seems to me like we're in this moment in politics where a lot of the elected officials are deeply unserious. And a governor's election here may well be decided on something that is non-existent. And that's appalling. you know, infrastructure, I guess, makes people's eyes glaze over, but we had a rainstorm a few months ago where the VCU campus was inundated. And not to put too fine a point on it, but that's not exactly on the waterfront. It's up on a hill, and yet we had a flood. And that speaks to infrastructure, it speaks to climate, it speaks to all sorts of things that we're neglecting in the culture wars and in silliness. So if any party can actually, I mean, I guess the Republicans, you know, for how many decades now have had success with the culture wars. It's become what they do. But we need someone in some party to actually do something about very real problems that this state and this nation are facing, that the globe is facing. Because this isn't working. It'll win some elections, but it's not going to do what we need to do from a sustainability standpoint as a state, as a nation, as a planet.
Thanks, Michael Paul Williams, along with Jeff Shapiro, Kelly